welcome to The Art of Conversation, a radio show dedicated to a college course dedicated to the art of conversation. This program is brought to you by the Eileen G. Jones Honors College and the Department of Communication Studies, Media, and Journalism at Commonwealth University, Bloomsburg. I'm your host, Eric C. Miller, Professor of Communication Studies. Each semester, I teach a class available in your course catalog as Honors 211, The Art of Conversation, that focuses on the ancient art of dialectic, that is, the collaborative process by which knowledgeable peers pursue the truth through focused question and answer. After a few weeks of wading through the theory on these matters, our students spend about 10 weeks in practice, holding twice-weekly 75-minute deep dives into topics and questions of their choosing. Our theme this semester is the state of the earth and the good life upon it, granting students considerable leeway in their choice of content. Every week, twice a week, we're talking about how to live better lives on this planet. My guests today are Hannah and Maddie, a pair of student moderators who this week asked our class how we ought to respond to the problem of food insecurity in the United States. Hannah, Maddie, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Before we get started today, why don't you tell us just a little bit about yourselves?
So my name is Hannah. I am a junior here at Bloomsburg University. I'm a health science major with a track in physical therapy, pre-physical therapy. And yeah, this is one of my courses for honors, and I've really enjoyed it so far. It's fun to have a more discussion-based class being a science major. I have a lot of lecture and exam-heavy courses, so this has been really fun to kind of talk and get to know some of my classmates more.
And I'm Maddie. I'm a junior as well. I'm a media and journalism major, a media production focus. I have also really enjoyed this class. I've learned a lot so far, and I look forward to discussing some more issues and learning more in the coming weeks.
Well, great. We're glad to have you. And we're going to get into the definitional questions about food insecurity in just a moment. But one more scene-setting question. What is it that prompted you to choose this topic for your discussion? You could have talked about anything, but you wanted to talk about food insecurity. What's the motivation?
Yeah, so in high school, I was really involved with addressing food insecurity. I was in Girl Scouts, so I did my Gold Award in high school, and my project was focused on establishing a food bank at my church. So I spent about 2 years in high school working on that with my family, with friends, with church members and community members. And it was just an incredibly rewarding experience. And I got to see firsthand some of the things that my classmates or families in my community struggled with. And just being able to help them was such a gift to me and just really helped drive home the importance of this issue.
Yeah, I would agree. I also did a lot of work with food banks in my area growing up, and especially in high school through my church and stuff. And so I just was really interested in this issue, and I think it's an issue that should be solved because it's, people need food to survive. It's a basic human issue, and so I think the more we can talk about it and discuss possible solutions and raise awareness, the better.
Well, fantastic. Maybe we'll start with the basic definitional question. When we talk about food insecurity, what are we talking about? What is this problem?
So the U.S. Department of Agriculture defines food security as access by all people at all times to enough food for an active, healthy lifestyle. Therefore, one of the articles we read defined food insecurity as the lack of access to or the limited availability of nutritionally adequate food prevents all household members from leading an active and healthy life.
You used a couple of terms in there that, as I recall from our discussion in class, are significant also, those being access and availability. So as these terms are used by the USDA or other institutions, what do they mean?
So access and availability are two of the big parts of food insecurity. So food availability, that's not an issue in the whole world. Like, we have more than enough food available for everyone. The problem comes more with accessibility, and is that food available to everyone all over the world? So if you want to break it down, I would say availability is more, is there enough of a food supply? Is there enough food being produced to feed people in an area, and is that food available to people living in different areas? So are there like grocery stores, and are there places that food can be purchased and received. Accessibility focuses more on, do people have access to it? Can they get to those grocery stores? They might not have a car or money for gas to drive and get the food. They might not have a home to store the food. They also could have not enough financial resources to purchase food. So that's kind of the difference between food availability and accessibility.
So when we talk about food insecurity, we are not talking about a world that fails to produce enough food or a supply chain that fails to get food to different parts of the country. We're talking about the remaining obstacles that might prevent people from actually getting to these places and purchasing the food that is otherwise available to them. Is that accurate?
Yes.
I know that sometimes when a particular area, a region, a town, a neighborhood, or something like that has a food insecurity problem, it is sometimes designated as a food desert. So I'm wondering if you can shed some light on this for us. What constitutes a food desert? How is it defined?
So according to the USDA, a food desert is a low-income census tract where at least 500 people, or 33% of the population, live more than a half mile from the nearest supermarket or large grocery store in an urban area, or more than 10 miles from a grocery store in a rural area.
So the food desert designation is specific to distance, basically.
Mm-hmm.
How far are you from a grocery store where you are able to access healthy food options, right?
Correct.
Because I know they talk about, in some cases, a food desert might exist in the middle of a city where you wouldn't expect, but it's in part because they don't have great grocery stores available. A lot of the food options that are there consist of fast food or other things that wouldn't qualify here because they're not healthy. The access to nutritional options seems to be really important to all of these definitions. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it is. And I think that is a really important point to make, and was something that I learned as we were researching this, is that food deserts are they're not what you expect. I didn't expect food deserts to be as prevalent as they are, but again, it goes back to, it's not just is there any food available, it's is there healthy, nutritious food in an accessible distance. So even if there's a grocery store 4 or 5 miles away, a family who doesn't have a car can't walk to that grocery store and bring it back a whole week's worth of groceries. And even if there are convenience stores or fast food restaurants, that is not meeting our definition of food security. So it's a lot more prevalent than I was initially aware of.
It seems like rural areas would be especially vulnerable to this just because everything is further apart. And so, as I recall, the distance that you mentioned was 10 miles in a rural area versus 5 miles in an urban area. Is that correct?
Correct.
So out here in rural Pennsylvania, does that mean that food deserts are common?
I think they're a lot more common than a lot of people realize, especially in today's society where, most people have access to a car or someone who has a car that can drive them. I think that makes it easier for us to not realize, I can just drive 10 minutes down the road to this grocery store. And so we don't run into these issues, and so they don't realize how prevalent they are. But I think they are fairly prevalent here in rural Pennsylvania.
This question brought the issue kind of home for us in that some suggested that perhaps Bloomsburg is a food desert. And the suggestion here was that, we have a Walmart out at Buckhorn, and there is a Giant and a Weis down on 11. But it's entirely possible that you don't live within a half mile of any of these things. The two grocery stores are right next to each other, and the Walmart is way out on the other end of town. Maybe I'm missing something, but those seem to be like the grocery options in this area. So, is this a concern of yours? Do you think that Bloomsburg could qualify as a food desert?
I think it's definitely an issue. Food insecurity in general is an issue in Bloomsburg. I would want to look more into the statistics specific to Bloomsburg before I would label it as a food desert, but I know for sure that it's an issue. I volunteered at the food bank down in town, and they have so many people come through at least 2 or 3 times a week. So it is for sure an issue here.
I know the Agape organization downtown deals in this sort of thing as well. So there are folks locally who are trying to sort of push back against it.
Yeah.
So if a lack of grocery stores is part of the problem, or if their geographical placement is a problem just because people don't live close to them, is that the root of the problem? Or if you were to try and diagnose this problem from the very cause out through the effects, what would that look like?
Well, I think one of the biggest root causes that we've discussed is just poverty in general. Low wages, things like that make it harder for people to have even the money to not only get food, but like Hannah said earlier, like have a car to be able to get to their food, or to have, the time to take an hour to go to the grocery store and buy the things that they need. I think that's one of the big root causes, but certainly not the only one.
Yeah, that was one thing we really talked about in class a lot, is the issue of food insecurity just kind of a surface level problem, or is it more systemic? And I think the answer we were trying to get to, and I think we did talk about it a lot, is that the issue of food insecurity is a systemic issue. There's so many underlying issues, like Maddie said. Poverty is the biggest contributor to food insecurity, and that in itself has so many other systemic issues within it.
So you mentioned that poverty is an important contributing factor to this. Maybe we could dig into this a little bit further, and I'll just ask, well, where does poverty come from? Why is poverty an issue potentially in this part of the wealthy Western world?
One of our resources we looked at in class, it was called the root causes of hunger and poverty. And so even though we talked about this earlier, we have plenty of food to feed everyone on the earth, for no one to be hungry, the systems that get the food to people are where the issue lies, and just the systems in general that are still in place in our country and just all over the world. So some of the things we talked about was housing insecurity or inequality within education. We also talked about different issues like political disenfranchisement and inadequate safety nets during economic hardship. So we can dive into some of those a little more.
Well, it sounds like if we dig down that rabbit hole any further, we'll end up at a critique of all of American society.
Yeah.
I know sometimes when it becomes a question of a systemic issue versus like a private issue or a personal responsibility issue. And I think some people, if they struggle to feed themselves or their families, would come away thinking of this as a personal failure.
Mm-hmm.
This was my responsibility to be a provider, and I am failing at it because I can't make enough money or something. Is it your sense that that is part of this problem, or are you unwilling to place the blame on individuals?
I do think that is a portion of this problem. And one of our classmates said in class, there's a stigma about it, about being food insecure and asking for help. The strength of this stigma has impacted some people, and it's made them, maybe be a little bit more reluctant to ask for help or to inquire about the programs that are in place to help people. And so I think that is part of the problem, in that we should, getting to some of like the ways we can help solve food insecurity, is we need to get rid of the stigma, because it's a societal problem. It's not just one person or one family. And so I think by breaking down those barriers, we can help other people know there is help. No one's gonna judge you for it. It's not a you problem, it's an everyone. We all need to work together to solve this kind of thing. And so I think that would benefit a lot of families today.
It's a product of systems that are not serving all the people that they were intended to serve and how they were intended to serve them. So I would not place the blame on families. Like Maddie said, we've talked about it's a systemic issue. So these families are facing this stigma, but it's almost like this endless cycle. Like talked about in class, how inequality of educational opportunities, housing insecurity sets up kids to go to school with maybe not all of the resources that other children might have. And also just hunger in general. Going to school hungry sets up kids to not be able to do as well in their studies. And so families who struggle with this, their foundation is food insecurity. And so then they're just trying to keep their heads above water and can't ever get to the point where they do feel food secure or they have secure housing. So it's just like this endless loop, and it's our job as students and as citizens of the U.S. to try and push these policies that will help break that cycle so that these families can be food secure. Food is a basic human need and right. No one should have to go without it.
Well, clearly the government does agree with you there at all levels, because as communities, locally, statewide, federally, there are programs in place to try and help provide for people who are suffering from food insecurity. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about these. What are we doing to try and address this problem?
Sure. So there are three main federal policies in place right now. The first is SNAP, which is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and that provides food for families and people who are food insecure, and it gives them access to nutritious food. The second main policy is WIC, which stands for Women, Infants, and Children, and this focuses specifically on women and then their babies and their children up to age 5. And then the third program is the Federal Student Lunch Program, which gives students or children in school access to free school lunches so that they have at least one meal a day.
So SNAP and WIC, they are providing more of the financial side to go purchase food, whereas the lunch programs are providing food to students. And we talked about in class that these programs have helped a lot. I worked at a grocery store over the summer, so I saw a lot of our customers use these programs and be really grateful and helpful that they were in place. I think one other thing we also talked about, Maddie, you really focused on this, and I thought this was an interesting statistic, is that during the pandemic, the stimulus checks that would come out based on how many kids you had in your household. Do you want to talk about that a little? I think it's interesting.
Sure. So the government issued child tax credits to families, which basically just came in the form of some financial aid, some money to help pay for, food and other nutrition and supplies that children would need. And so this, I believe, was implemented in the summer of 2021, but then by December 2021, they had stopped issuing these monthly child tax credit payments because the funding had run out. And so then there was a survey conducted in May 2022, which showed that nearly half of the respondents who had previously received these monthly child tax credit payments now were back in the same position where they could not put food on the table, and they were really struggling still in 2022. So this basically showed that while the program did provide a lot of immediate assistance and it was greatly beneficial to families while they were receiving it, it didn't do much in actually solving the problem and helping families be able to provide for themselves or be put in a better position going forward. So it was beneficial while it lasted, but it didn't really help solve those root causes that we were discussing earlier.
I remember when that happened, because I remember people saying that this just goes to show that if we want to, as like a nation, we can eradicate child poverty. Mm-hmm. And for a time, thanks to an international pandemic, we made it happen. And then we stopped doing it, suggesting that we weren't that committed to the project. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an interesting, it gets back to that same question of whose responsibility it is to make sure that children are fed. Is it the responsibility of the individual parents and families? Is it the responsibility of the state? And one way of answering that question, or one way we have answered it, is through the free school lunch program that you've mentioned. And I wonder if you might say a little bit more about that. I know a lot of kids really depend on the schools to provide a significant portion of their calories each day.
So this was actually something we talked a fair amount about in class, and I think we all have kind of had experience with it. We talked about our high school experiences, how before COVID, and I think COVID, that changes the whole game when we're talking about this conversation. But before COVID, we had the free lunch program, and certain families could qualify for it. But then post-COVID, at least in my school, and I know some of the other students expressed this as well, was that lunch became free for all students. That's a really awesome way to address food insecurity in the immediate, but long term, again, it's not addressing the root cause of poverty. And we talked about too how the lunch program is great to get food in kids' bellies, but how we often all witnessed like other kids or even ourselves, you'd have to get certain things at lunch, like you have to get a main course and a vegetable and a fruit. Well, these kids might not always like those things, so this money is being poured into this really awesome program to try and address an issue that's really important, but it might not accomplish all that it was intended to in the working outs of the policy. So if kids don't like the food they're being given, they're still hungry. And we talked about too, like, the nutritional value of this food. In one of my other classes, Intro to Exercise and Health Science, we talked about how school lunchrooms are like the biggest growing fast food companies because there's so many students to feed, for one, and a lot of it is pre-made, ultra-processed foods that we're feeding these kids. So it's not meeting our definition of food security. It's not nutritious, adequate food.
I recall when Michelle Obama made that her pet cause, trying to get healthy foods to kids in schools. And I remember part of that discussion focused on how these different foods are categorized. So you would hear about how pizza was like checking off several boxes because it contains dairy and bread and like tomato sauce as a vegetable. Or you would hear about ketchup being classified as a vegetable because it's extracted from tomato paste or something. Is that still the case? Should we be concerned about what kids are still being served in public school lunchrooms?
I would say yes. Just speaking from my own experience, the options that were given at lunch typically weren't the most nutritious, and especially as I was going into like middle school and high school, I was kind of more aware of that. There was a lot of pizza, and like my middle school, you could get a cheeseburger and fries every day, and the line was always out the door. Like that's what the students wanted. Even like nachos or French toast sticks, things like that. And I think a big part of that is because it's easy, and those things are easy to mass produce, and they're easy to cook fast and cook, like Hannah was saying, like at a large level because there are so many students to feed. But experiencing it, like I'm not sure those are the most nutritious options to be feeding children, especially if for some students who are food insecure, if that's the only thing they're getting all day, like I'm not sure that's giving them the nutrition that they need. And most of the time, again, from personal experience, like it doesn't fill you up the whole day. Like you are hungry again in a couple hours just because it does lack those nutritious aspects of it.
And going back to like whether kids are even going to eat the food or not, this is a conversation my family and I had a lot growing up. My dad was in the education field, so he saw this firsthand too in his job. He was a guidance counselor, so he worked with some of the families that really needed that extra support in the lunch programs. We had like these posters in our lunchroom that said like you need a vegetable and a fruit and a grain. But like you said, Dr. Miller, oftentimes those weren't adequate foods to sustain a child throughout the day. But these kids, if they don't like vegetables or they don't like what's being served, they're not being helped at all. And in fact, then we're pumping all this money into a program that like isn't even being utilized to its full potential. And one thing I think is interesting to point out too, we talked about this in class, is it was a quote from the article that we had discussed. And it's from a mom who, her kids were in school, I believe, and she was talking about food insecurity and the policies that have been put in place. And she said, it's impossible to make policies that will be effective if you don't include the people that will be impacted. If you never lived it, then you don't know it. And I think the school lunch program might be kind of a good example of that.
I think one of the important elements of education is developing the maturity over time to understand that the world is complex and there are no easy fixes to this. And this issue is a great example of this. It's something that I can speak to now a little bit as a parent. Sometimes kids just don't want to eat what you put in front of them. And sometimes the more effort you put into making sure that they are getting healthy options, the more frustrating it becomes, because all they want is macaroni and cheese and chicken nuggets and pizza. Like, insert the terrible option of your choice. That's what they prefer. And so I could see this being like a really frustrating problem to solve, because even if you do figure out what they need, and even if you do get the money to pay for it, and even if you do manage to deliver on it such that every cafeteria in the country has this wealth of delicious whole food items, if they throw it in the trash, like, what has been achieved? And that's a real challenge, without a doubt. I wonder, though, if we might expand on this a little bit, or push it a little bit further, because one thing that came up in the course of our discussion in class is that these issues tend to overlap and intertwine so much that they're difficult to disentangle. And the other issue that I have in mind here is the minimum wage, because I've heard a lot of student presentations and read papers over the years about the minimum wage and how it's federally set at $7.25 and has not been increased, I think, since 2009, hasn't kept pace with inflation, isn't a living wage, et cetera, et cetera. And that is a major contributor to poverty, in part because people can't afford healthy food options. But it's also kind of it ends up being a burden on all citizens, insofar as companies that pay their employees a minimum wage basically outsource the feeding of their employees to taxpayers who fund programs like SNAP and WIC and CHIP and the others. So in other words, instead of paying their employees well enough that they can actually provide for their families, they pay their employees so little that the taxpayer has to pay for the feeding of their families. And in some cases, people who work minimum wage jobs work 2 jobs or 3 jobs and are still drawing upon these benefits. And so I'm wondering if you've given this any thought, how the minimum wage being so low contributes to the creation of poverty, which contributes to food insecurity. Have you thought about the intersectional relationships here between these different issues?
So we discussed this a little bit in class as well. Let's say someone is making minimum wage. They're most likely, as you said, working 2 or 3 jobs. So that's taking up a lot of their time, and most of the time they're still not making enough money to sufficiently be able to feed their family and get the food and the nutrition and the housing and even transportation that they need. But this also impacts food insecurity in that if they're working most of the day or even all of the day, there's no time to go and get food. There's no time to, take public transportation to get to the grocery store, or even if if they have a car, to take their own car and spend an hour to go to the grocery store, or even to get to the local food bank. And so this frequently leaves people, again, without food because they don't have time in their day. Or if they do, it's at 9 o'clock at night when everything's closed or nothing is available for them. And so I think that's another big aspect of this problem, in that if we were to raise the minimum wage and it would be more of a living wage, not only would, these families be receiving more money for the work that they're already doing, but they would have more time to get to the grocery store to get the food or to cook the food. Another big issue is if kids are left alone all day, especially, as they're getting into like middle school and high school and they can be left at home alone, is the food that they have in the house something that they can cook? Are they going to be able to make the meal or feed themselves with the food that they have? And so I think raising the minimum wage would allow parents to, work during the day, receive the income that they need, but then also be able to cook better foods and more nutritious dinners and even breakfasts or lunches or whatever for their students and their children.
Yeah, I agree, Maddie, with all that you said. And this was something else we talked about in class too regarding that topic, is that if these families are spending so much of their day working, if they're working 2 or 3 jobs, when they do have time to cook, again, they're going to be so exhausted and maybe, again, not have the time to cook these nutritious meals. It's going to have to be more of the convenience food just so they can get food in their kids' bellies. And I also think, going back to the minimum wage being so low, not being able to buy food obviously has a big consequence, not getting nutrition or the calories you need each day. But I think probably oftentimes what happens is that the money that these families are making has to go to other things first, because if you don't pay your water bill, your water gets shut off. If you don't pay your electric bill, your electricity gets shut off. Or if you don't pay your rent, you get evicted. But if you don't feed yourself, there's no consequence from someone else. It's just your own suffering that you have to go through. So I think oftentimes the money that is being made on these minimum wages, that's not even a living wage, is oftentimes having to be put towards things that aren't food.
I think that really speaks to the importance of having people who have experienced this stuff personally involved in the decision-making process, because there's so much here that those of us who don't suffer from food insecurity take for granted. Like I would not have to quantify, the number of dollars in my wallet, the number of hours in my day, the amount of energy that I have to work with, the distance that I have to travel to get to the grocery store. For most people, these things aren't even considerations. And for people who do have to consider them, they become real obstacles and enable the sort of problem that you're describing. And so, having considered for a minute some of the different policy options that are already in place, do you have others that you think we should be pursuing going forward, or other ideas for how this problem might be addressed more adequately?
Yeah, so one thing Maddie and I talked about a lot as we were researching is that we did find so many people and statistics that have supported WIC and SNAP and all these other programs that they really are making a difference. But in the long term, this was a conversation that we had, these programs, while they are effective, it's more like a Band-Aid fix to a deep wound. It's not going to fix the issue. It's not going to heal it. It's just kind of covering it up.
Going along with what Hannah said, one of our big issues that we were thinking about when discussing SNAP and WIC and their effectiveness is, are there better ways, instead of just handing people some money to go and buy your food or anything like that, are there other things that, the government could be providing or the government could change to, instead of just handing people money, to actually make a better difference in the world? And so some of the things the article discussed was, like we discussed, increasing the federal minimum wage, but also providing affordable transportation and housing. And we discussed in class a little bit about how housing is a big issue when it comes to food insecurity, because if you don't have a house to store your food, or a place to, a fridge to store your vegetables and your fruit and all your food that you have, then it really does limit, again, the amount of food that you can have, because things will go bad eventually, and if you don't have a place to store them, that's a big issue. And we also said providing quality childcare and educational resources, because if you give people the ability to educate themselves, they can most likely get higher paying jobs and get higher jobs in the workforce, which brings, again, more income. And having affordable childcare allows for people to not have to worry about, oh, I can't work this job right now because I have to take care of my child.
Since these things often come from private sources, you want to buy a house, you got to buy that house from whoever's selling it. Or if you want to rent a place, you got to pay the rent that the renter is asking. If you want to send your kids to daycare or to preschool, you have to pay kind of the going rate. So what role does the government have in pursuing these alternative policy options that you're considering?
So this is something we talked about in class a little bit, and I want to touch on a little more here. So we looked at that one resource, root causes of hunger and poverty, and two that we didn't talk about here today was the criminalization of communities and neighborhood disinvestment. So like Maddie said, so far these programs that have been put in place are funding money to families to buy food, but we talked about how poverty is one of the root sources of food insecurity. So maybe what might be beneficial for the government to be doing is to start putting some more money and resources and time into these communities that are facing disinvestment and criminalization. So communities that are lower income, impoverished, don't have resources or don't have access to resources, I should say, and kind of trying to build those communities up so that that cycle that we talked about earlier is broken and these families can start to flourish in their communities.
I agree. And another possible solution and way that the government can help that Hannah and I came up with was building more grocery stores in these communities that Hannah's talking about. If people can get to these places and get the food that they need, it would be greatly beneficial. And so we talked about, I think Hannah was just talking about this, the criminalization of communities and like the disenfranchisement. One of the things we discussed in class was that big companies like Giant or Walmart or places like that typically see these communities and don't see a ton of wealth in them, and so therefore they don't want to build their stores there because they're looking to make the profit and they're looking for where the group of people are located that are going to buy their products and are going to fund the company. And so this typically leaves certain populations in certain communities without, like we were talking about earlier, like without resources and without grocery stores nearby and with only, convenience stores or things like that, which don't provide the nutrition that children need. And so by building grocery stores and farmers markets or places where people can get like healthy, nutritious food in these low income communities can really have a big difference.
The phrase that pops into my mind listening to you say these things is the phrase profits over people. Are you familiar with this? It's like a rally, sort of an exclamation that people use at rallies and in activism. And I'm reminded of it so often when I talk about social issues with students in class and I guess on the radio now. The system in which we live and work and operate caters to companies that are trying to make money. And when it comes to the well-being of their customers and their employees and their neighbors and community members day in and day out, it's kind of beside the point. The system rolls on under the assumption that this relentless pursuit of profit will benefit all of us eventually in different ways. And one takeaway for me that comes out of these conversations again and again is that it doesn't benefit everyone. The question is, do we care about that? Or do we think that that is an indictment of the system such that we would want to change it? Or do we think that this is just really the best that we can do? I mean, what do you think about that? Are you satisfied with the way that we live? Is that too big of a consideration to try and wrap your head around?
I think this ties into so many conversations we've had in class. So one of the headings in our article actually goes along with that. It was something along the lines of the issue with these policies is that they prioritize profits over people. So it's really interesting that you bring that up. But yeah, I don't think that if we keep prioritizing profit and making money that it's going to benefit us all. I think it benefits a very small percentage of the country and the people that live in it. And it brings me back to how we talked about, I think it was this past week, that there's only so long that the economy can grow. Eventually it can't grow anymore because we're not going to have the resources for it. And also the article about, what was it, saving the kid who was drowning in the pond.
Peter Singer's Famine, Affluence, and Morality.
Yes. So it's our job to save the people drowning in the pond, who are drowning in the pond of food insecurity.
I would love to do an episode of this show sometime in which we talk just about Peter Singer and famine, affluence, and morality, and the child drowning in the pond. Unfortunately, it's going to exist somewhat out of context here because we don't really have the time to dig into it properly. But to kind of guide us here towards the end of this discussion about food insecurity, as you have considered these things and as you look ahead, you've considered kind of the past and the present of food insecurity in America. Does your reading suggest that we are on a trajectory into the future that is positive or negative or about the same? Is it getting better or worse? Do you have a sense of what we can expect given the policies that we have?
I would say, I don't know if our article really discussed, where we are headed, but I would say, just coming from like a personal opinion, I don't think if we just continue going the way that we are going and continue doing the things that we're doing, I'm not sure how much worse we'll get, but we're definitely not going to get better. And I think, again, like, these situations are just going to continue unless we do something. And so I think, it's up to us. Now is as good a time as any to kind of try to combat these issues and come up with solutions and put things in place that might not help someone tomorrow, but it might help them in a year or 5 years. It's not going to be easy, and it's definitely not going to be cheap to try to solve these issues, but I think setting ourselves up and trying to get these plans into motion now can set us up for a much better future.
Yeah, I agree. I think the article kind of talks about and takes this point, and I think this is kind of where we landed too, is that we have the resources to solve hunger and food insecurity. It's just not being used in the best way. But like Maddie said, if we can start kind of making that shift to try solving it now and a few years down the line, I think it could be a much more positive environment in that sense.
Hannah and Maddie, thank you for joining me on the show today.
Thank you for having us.
This has been The Art of Conversation, a program brought to you by the Eileen G. Jones Honors College and the Department of Communication Studies, Media, and Journalism at Commonwealth University in Bloomsburg. I am your host, Eric C. Miller. I appreciate you joining us today, and we will see you next time.